Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Morgan. I'm an associate professor of music at St. Joe's, and I'm happy to be with you tonight to share some thoughts about the repertoire that Shai Wosner is going to be playing for us on April the 8th. We have in this program essentially pairs of sonatas, two pretty big sonatas, one by Schubert and one by Beethoven, and then we have three pairs of sonatas by Domenico Scarlatti and Frederick Rzewski. So I'm going to speak about sort of how this program was put together and share my perspective both as a musicologist and also as a pianist about what Shai will be playing for us. So we have on this program these Scarlatti and Zevsky sonatas, each of which is just one movement. And when I heard that Shai was going to be performing these works, I wondered if he would be doing them as a set or if he would be interspersing little short sonatas throughout the program in some way. And it is as a set that he's playing these. So we alternate between Scarlatti and Rzewski. Clearly a lot of thought went in to how these were ordered. And that's true both in terms of sort of the musical idioms and ideas and also in terms of the harmonic language. So for instance, when we hear this Rzewski sonata, the second one that we'll hear, it's a very improvisatory sounding work with a lot of different ideas, ones that sort of follow on the footsteps of each other. And so it has this kind of spontaneous feeling. And then it's followed by the Scarlatti sonata in C minor, which has that same kind of concept going on. In the Scarlatti, you have a kind of dominant feeling and then all of a sudden just switches gears to something really different that feels a little bit like an improvisation, and then it goes back. That Scarlatti ends on these octaves on C, and then the next Rzewski begins, and that begins on a middle C. So harmonically, as well as in terms of the musical affect, these follow each other in a very planned out kind of fashion. The Rzewski sonatas are pretty recent compositions by the American composer. And overall, I would say that they're very gestural pieces. And what I mean by that is that they explore a kind of pianistic language at the keyboard. So they're exploring things that the piano can do, sounds it can make, and taking a lot of little gestures and sort of passing them around and transforming them, so treating them motivically. There's some influence of minimalism, which I'm sure you will catch throughout the pieces. And there's also a sense of a kind of stream of consciousness writing, a feeling of improvisation, which they share, as I said earlier, with the Scarlatti. Scarlatti sonatas were composed largely for Maria Barbara, who was a member of the royal family of Portugal and then who moved to Spain. And Scarlatti spent much of his career acting as her private teacher at the keyboard and also as her kind of personal composer. He wrote over 500 keyboard sonatas, and in his lifetime, they would have been played mostly on the harpsichord, as well as other keyboard instruments. The wonderful musicologist Sarah Gross Ceballos at Lawrence University in Wisconsin has looked into ways in which Scarlatti's keyboard sonatas that he wrote for Maria Barbara act as a kind of musical portrait of her. Clearly, she was really good at playing the harpsichord. Many of his pieces for her are very unabashed in their virtuosity. So they have gestures like hand crossings and rapidly moving scales that not only are difficult to execute, but they show off how difficult they are to execute. In other words, they're really the musical language for somebody who is quite confident at the keyboard and knows she's really good. So we can make these assumptions about Maria Barbara's playing. She would have played only at home. She never performed in public. That would have just been considered a kind of indecent act for a woman of her time and especially of her social stature. But she clearly was quite the accomplished virtuosa. But Ceballos has also explored how some of his sonatas might be seen as portraits of her personality as well as of her musicality. When Maria Barbara moved from Portugal to Spain, she had something to prove. She was becoming the queen of a culture that wasn't her own, and she was a foreigner. And we know that she was very interested in the affairs of state and in getting involved. She kind of stayed behind the scenes, but at the same time, she was clearly interested in what the government was doing. She was interested in the affairs of the military, and she expressed her opinion. She made it known. And part of what Maria Barbara needed to do was to kind of prove herself to the Spanish people, to show that she had embraced their culture as her own. And so we can look at some of Scarlatti's works as really showcasing Spanish elements, and perhaps the reason for that is that these were works Maria Barbara would play that would sort of bring out that element of her personality. So for instance, in the first of the Scarlatti sonatas that we'll hear this evening, which is Kirkpatrick 141, the sonata in D minor, we have elements that imitate Spanish mandolin and guitar music. In the right hand of the keyboard, you'll hear these very rapidly executed repeated notes. That's mimicking a style of writing for the mandolin called tremolo. This is confusing a little bit because tremolo on the keyboard is something different. But on the mandolin, tremolo is what pianists would just call rapidly repeated notes, played over and over again. And that's a feature that's very much showcased throughout this one movement sonata. Very, very difficult to play without the pianist's arm kind of tensing up and fingers tensing up. Meanwhile, in the left hand of the piano, the pianist is rolling, or the keyboardist is rolling these chords. And that very much mimics a kind of writing for the guitar that was typical of Spain during the period in which Maria Barbara and Scarlatti lived. These strummed chords mimic something called rasgueado, which is a technique of Spanish guitar music of Maria Barbara's contemporaries. And so with our two hands put together, we have a real evocation of mandolin and guitar, and then particularly in the left hand, this evocation of Spanish guitar sounds and music. So let's hear a little bit of this. The performance I have here for us to listen to is Marta Argerich playing. It's a live recording. This sonata is known as one of Argerich's very favorite encores. So we'll hear a bit here. Besides our three pairs of short one-movement sonatas by Rzewski and Scarlatti, we then have two much bigger multi-movement sonatas, one by Schubert and one by Beethoven. These sonatas are written to some extent in the tradition of the first Viennese school, the language of Mozart and Haydn that was inherited by Beethoven and Schubert. Schubert and Beethoven, of course, were contemporaries. Although Schubert was much younger, they lived in Vienna at the same time, and they died just over within a year of each other. So they are two composers who are often not just looked at side by side by historians, but also very much so by pianists. Beethoven's pieces, so many of his sonatas, are very virtuosic, very intellectual and sort of difficult in terms of the challenges that the intellectuality presents. And some of them are very awkward at the piano. But truthfully, it's Schubert who scares me as a pianist. And the reason for that, I think, is that he explores textures at the keyboard that are very difficult to really execute effectively. Of course, Schubert was a great song composer. Even in a lot of his instrumental music, you get the sense of him as a songster. And that's very much the case in his keyboard music, and part of what makes it so difficult. So much of the time in Schubert, we hear the right hand of the piano executing this long melody, and a melody that shouldn't really feel encumbered by measures, but rather needs to have this very long sense of phrase, just really stretch itself out. And then meanwhile, the lower fingers of the right hand, as well as the left hand, are often playing the accompaniment. So chords or arpeggios, the kind of stuff that in a song would be played by the piano while the singer is singing that upper line. It is quite a balancing act for the pianist to make the melody seem sort of seamless and regulated by these very long phrases while playing all the other stuff below it. It demands a lot of control over just the exact amount of sound you're making and tremendous control over phrasing. And that's what makes Schubert so challenging much of the time. And those are the types of challenges we really see here in this sonata. His Sonata in A major, 664, is often referred to as the Little A major Sonata. So he wrote this in 1819, and the reason we pianists tend to call it the Little A major is because at the very end of his life, one of his final 3 sonatas was the Big A major Sonata, this much longer, more overtly bravura style sonata. So pianists call this one the Little A major, and I think for many pianists it's probably the first Schubert sonata that they play. It was mine. It's often given to students, people playing it in their preteen or teenage years. But I almost cringe revealing that information because this piece is by no means easy. It's very difficult to play well, and the reason for that is largely sort of what I was referring to earlier, the way in which the pianist has to control the melody versus the accompanying parts all at the same time and make them sound kind of effortless. Schubert dedicated this sonata to an amateur female pianist, and again, it's probably often played by students and certainly a piece that's considered within the grasp of a very skilled amateur. But to play it well is another thing. And so with all of those elements in terms of who it was intended for, the piece is sort of meant to sound effortless, pretty, enjoyable, and yet it's really, really a struggle to play it. To give us a sense of this, I'll demonstrate here in a recording some of the second movement. So here we have this beautiful lilting melody and then these chords underneath the tune that have to be controlled so carefully. So the other big multi-movement sonata on this program is Beethoven's Opus 31, number 3. This is a sonata that he composed in 1802. That's the same year as the Heiligenstadt Testament, Beethoven's very famous letter to his brothers, in which he confessed that he had the onset of hearing loss. And so this is during a time in his life when Beethoven was struggling and in despair, but it also is the year that really propelled propelled him into remarkable productivity. In 1802, after Beethoven wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament, he started composing at such a rapid pace, and it didn't really let up for 10 years. He just wrote music at this enormous rate, and some of his most beloved and famous music. So Opus 31, number 3, fits into that timeline, and yet I would say, rather than sounding like the other music of his heroic period, which is that time that kind of began around 1802, this piece in many ways evokes later works of Beethoven. And in particular, it makes me think of some of his transitional pieces written about a decade later that were leading from the heroic period to his late period. Works like An die ferne Geliebte, his song cycle, and also like his piano sonata, Das Lebewohl. That sonata is also in E-flat major, so they share the same key, and they also share a very notable opening, which is that both sonatas open with a horn call. Horn calls in German music of the 19th century often evoke a sense of longing and a sense of departure and absence. Certainly in Das Lebewohl, that's famously the case. Beethoven wrote the sonata upon the departure of a friend of his who had to flee Vienna during the French occupation. And the movements are entitled Departure, Absence, and Return, really representing the feelings that the composer himself had about his friends leaving and then eventually coming back. In Opus 31, number 3, we get many of those same emotional affects of longing, a kind of tenderness and inner feeling. And the horn calls are part of what communicates that. So let me demonstrate the very opening of the sonata. In terms of what we're longing for in this very lyrical opening, we are missing something, and that is our tonic chord. This sonata is in E-flat major, and by the conventions of the first Viennese school, we should hear our tonic pretty early, probably the first thing that we're going to hear. But instead, we start with this chord that's pretty ambiguous in terms of what it is, and that doesn't resolve right away. It doesn't resolve right until that moment where I stopped, which is in the 8th measure of the piece. So it's very, very late. And even then, it just pauses for a brief moment and then continues on. So in terms of trying to capture a feeling of longing, Beethoven has done it, not just in terms of the gestures and things and the mood of the piece, but also in the harmonic language. We are longing. We're longing to know what the heck key we're in. We don't really know. The sonata has the nickname The Hunt, and that's not a name that Beethoven gave to it, but I do think it's a pretty apt title. And part of the reason is for evocations of kind of horsey stuff. So besides the horn calls, which of course evoke a hunt because horns were carried by members of a hunting party in Beethoven's time, we also have other music in this sonata that mimics the sounds of horses. And so I'll give us just 2 examples here. This is from the second movement, a bit like a trotting horse. And then from the fourth movement is in 6/8 time, which is the same as the third movement, the final movement of Das Lebewohl. And much of it in 6/8 has a kind of jaunty, galloping sound. movement of Opus 31, number 3, is kind of a throwback. It's a minuet. So Beethoven started to get away from minuets as the third movement. That was very much a convention. It's very typical in the sonatas of Haydn, Beethoven's teacher. But we have a relatively conventional minuet in our third movement of this sonata. But what we have in the second and fourth movements, and also in the first, in the way that I already mentioned, is some pretty harmonically innovative music. So besides that opening of the first movement, we have in both the second and fourth movements some really unexpected modulations. Now, the second movement is full of surprises. There's unexpected modulations and there are unexpected accents all over the place. There's suddenly loud chords. But in both of those movements, we'll hear just these transitions or sudden movements into keys you don't expect. And I'll demonstrate one of these instances, or three of these instances really, from the second movement, the scherzo. So we'll hear first our opening theme of the scherzo, and then just back to back, we'll listen to that same theme coming back in the wrong key. Okay, here it is. And one more. So I hope I've given us all some things to listen for as we hear Shai's recital this evening. I'm sure that he's going to bring a tremendous amount of imagination to this program, as well as some very impressive pianism. So enjoy it. I'm certain that I will as well.